This is the second part of my talk, Proof of Advanced Knowledge in Ancient Egypt. And I'd like to point out, for those of you who don't know my work, first of all, it's much better to watch the first part before you watch this video, because they're linked. But also, I'd like to say that I'm not putting forward any kind of hypotheses in particular here. What I'm doing is showing some actual facts that anybody can check up on, but which really change the way that we can look at what these ancient Egyptian peoples were doing and show how they had incredibly advanced knowledge, which for the time being we don't take into consideration. The image that's up now, the slide that's up, is from the first talk where I showed the existence of a 3-4-5 triangle in whole numbers of kilometers between the temples of Abydos, Luxor, a 3-4-5 triangle which actually goes between the Colossi of Memnon, and that was the first part of this talk. Now, today I'm going to go more into the temples in southern Egypt, but to further south. But to start off with, I'd like to come back to these three temples. So the Temple of Dendera, which is just near the River Nile, north of Luxor. It was dated to 3000 BC. The most ancient site there is 3000 BC. The present-day temple was built between 305 and 30 BC. So the present-day temple is much more recent, but the site itself is very old, and that's important for what we're going to be studying. Also, the Temple of Luxor, which I talked about in the first part of this talk. Again, this is from the Middle Empire, started in 1392 BC. And also the Temple of Abydos, known as the Temple of Seti I, which was started in 1295 BC. So these three temples are situated around the meander in the Nile here. And here we can see the triangle that I showed in the first part, which is placed according to cardinal directions. So it's a 3-4-5 triangle exact according to cardinal directions. But what we're going to see now is that the Temple of Dendera here on the banks of the Nile actually is positioned at exactly the same angle from Abydos as it is from Luxor, 3.51 degrees south of east from Abydos and 3.51 degrees east of north from Luxor. So this gives us a perfect right angle between on the lines coming from Abydos and Luxor. Now, that would give us a new triangle with an angle of 33.36 degrees, because it's the angle of a 3-4-5 triangle minus 3.51 degrees. And this triangle gives a ratio of 11 on its shortest side to 20 on the hypotenuse. Okay, but what's interesting is that we can draw a circle which goes through the Temple of Abydos and Luxor, and which will go through the two corners. This is because in geometry, if I have the diagonal of a circle, then if I draw a right-angled triangle from that line, the corner will always be on the circumference of a circle. That's a geometrical law. Okay? So we have a right-angled triangle with the cardinal directions, but we also have a right-angled triangle with the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. And so these two triangles are on the same circle, as you can see, the yellow circle here. So I'd just like to look into this. So we're going to zoom in to see exactly how precise this actually is. It's really quite incredible when we zoom in to look at this. So we're going in first to the Temple of Seti in Abydos, and the yellow line that represents the circle, we can see it going straight through, down through the center of the temple here, and through the center of the Assyrian, which is behind it. And now we're going to go across towards the east, towards Dendera, and you can see the circle coming down through from the north, going right exactly through the corner, and right at the top of the temple here, in this hypostyle room where all the columns are at the entrance of the Temple of Dendera. So that's very precise positioning. And then from here, if we go up to Luxor, so now we're going to head south towards the Temple of Luxor, which is on the banks of the River Nile. And you can see how this circle, here's the Temple of Luxor, and you can see how the yellow line of the circle goes right down the major axis here of the temple. So that's really quite incredible. There's 90 kilometers between Abydos and Luxor, so the radius of this circle is 45 kilometers, exactly 45,000 meters. Okay, so that's an interesting fact. Now we're going to look at the Temple of Khnum in Esna and its relationship with the Temple of Horus in Edfu. So we're going a little further south along the Nile here. The Temple of Esna, which we can see here, can't see the date of it, but this temple dates from about 100 BC. And this temple has been undergoing restoration recently. Incredible engravings have been revealed. Here you can see the scaffolding, but look at the colors on the ceiling here. This is incredible discovery. This temple didn't used to be visited much, and now it's coming back on the tourist guide because of these incredible engravings being revealed. And we must thank my friend Robert Temple for his part in this, Robert and Olivia Temple, who took part in financing this project. And some engravings, some paintings and engravings which come out are really original, unlike any others that are to be seen in Egypt. Here we have the sky, Nut, here, with 13 moons up here, and then a 14th one here, and then a really strange figure of a four-headed, well, it's a ram's head, four ram's head on a standing figure here. So these are very original paintings which are being revealed. This is the ceiling. This ceiling was covered with soot because people were actually working in the temple and lit fires and things, so the whole of the ceiling was black. And here you see all these vultures going right across the ceiling. So it's really beautiful restoration. This is the ground plan of the temple, which is very similar, a big hypostyle room to start with, and then as further you go into the temple, right into the Holy of Holies in the center of the temple. And this is the Temple of Horus in Edfu. I talked about this in the previous talk. This dates to about 300 BC, between 300 BC and about 30 BC. Beautiful temple again with a lot of engravings. This is the pronaos, or the kind of inner courtyard, and then the temple behind this. I showed this in the first part of this talk. Now, what we're going to discover here is something really very incredible, is that the distance between the Temple of Khnum in Esna and the Temple of Horus in Edfu is exactly half the distance between the Temple of Khnum in Esna and the Temple of Hathor in Dendera. Okay. So I've drawn here two circles, red circles of identical size. And we'll have a look into this. So between Esna and Edfu, here, this is between the temples, right? Between the temples is a distance of 47,348 meters. And between the temple of Esna and Dendera, 94,697 meters, exactly twice the distance. Okay? 96 or 97 meters. Yeah. So let's have a look at the precision of this. So again, we're going to zoom down into the temple of Hathor in Dendera and see where the red circle goes in here. So look, we can see how the circle is going right through just behind the hypostyle room, the entrance room, and then we're going down to the temple of Khnum in Esna, and here we are again, exactly in the temple, right? We'll come back to this a little later. Now, the center of this circle is a spot here. Okay, this is the center of the circle. There's nothing here, but if we look up on the left-hand side, upper left of the image, we see the two statues of the Colossi of Memnon there. If we go along this circle, we go across the Nile, and we come to the temple of Mut, which is in Karnak. Okay, there's a lake around it, and this is the base of the temple here. Okay, which is so on this same circle, which has its center at Esna, and then which goes through the temple of Horus in Edfu. Let's go down to there. Here we can see it's going to go right through the center here. Through the main doorway of the temple, okay? So that's exactly the same size circle as the one that links together Dendera and Esna. Now, if I add to that the circle I showed earlier between Abydos and Luxor, the yellow circle, I've just put that back on, goes through Dendera as well. And we can see that the two red circles on the left-hand side are going to cross at exactly the same spot as the yellow circle. So those three circles go through one particular spot. See how precise that is. I think it'd probably be worth going and digging there or checking up on LiDAR to see if there's anything at that particular spot. But this shows an incredible geometrical coincidence. The yellow circle has a 90-kilometer diameter, whereas the red circles are at 94,697 meters. So the circles aren't the same size, but they coincide exactly at a specific point there. Okay, so that's a very astounding fact. Now we're going to go further south again to the temple of Horus the Elder and Sobek. So Horus the Elder was the initial version of Horus from the Heliopolis tradition, from the ancient empire. So he's a very old god. And Sobek is the crocodile god. And these are at Komombo. It's a strange temple because it has two entrances, not one. And it's kind of split into two. It has two parts to it. One part for Horus the Elder and the other part for Sobek. Okay. So this temple was started in the Middle Empire. There was building here from 1550 BC to 1000 BC. That's the Middle Empire. And then the present-day temple was built between 332 BC and 395 AD. But the beginning of this temple is contemporary to the beginning of Esna, for example, and Dendera, as we saw. Okay. Here are some pictures of the Temple of Komombo. Some incredible engravings on the walls, painted. Now, here we can see the temple from the air, and we're going to go in and look at it on Google Earth. Well, I'm going to show you here that there is a spot just outside the temple here on the left. We'll have a look in a minute, which is the remains of the older temple. So if we go from this temple up to the temple of Esna, okay, so we're going to exactly the same spot as before. Okay, so this is going to give us a value, which we can see at the top right-hand side of the screen. So this is over 100 kilometers, 100,553 meters on the map, with a heading of 338.20 degrees. Now, that direction from Komombo up to Esna is a very interesting orientation. And what we're going to do now is see that the angle of that, I think, now we can see the whole picture, okay? And if we look at the angle of that, we're going to see that the angle of 338.20 degrees from north, which is 21.8 degrees to the west of north. If we go from north all the way around, that's 338.2 degrees, or if we go this way to the west, that's 20.8 degrees. If we take the tangent of that, so what we're doing is seeing what is the ratio north, south, and east, west of this line, we get 0.4. Okay, 0.4. It's negative because it's towards the west. Okay, 0.4, which can be expressed as 2 over 5. So we can see that there's a sort of very simple geometrical relationship over a very long distance between these two temples of a 2 to 5 relationship. These are two numbers of the Fibonacci series, but this is a very precise relationship. And we're going to see that this relationship is going to give us some very interesting details as far as the measurements are concerned. Okay, so if we have 2 units by 5 units, to get the unit on the diagonal, which is the line that links the two temples together, we do by the Pythagorean theorem. We have to add the squares of the two sides, so 2 squared plus 5 squared equals 4 plus 25 equals 29, which means that diagonal will have a value. We have to take the square root of that, so the diagonal has a value of the square root of 29. Okay. Now, if we take the measurement of 100,523 meters here, and we divide that by the square root of 29, we get the result. So this gives us the size of each of these squares. Okay, what we're going to get here is the side length of each of these big squares. And we get the result of 18,666.66 or 65 meters. So that is really quite incredible because it's a whole number. It's 56 kilometers divided by 3. Okay. But what I want to show you now is how the temple itself at Comombo is linked geometrically to this geometry. So we've got a yellow line here. This is on Google Earth. You can see the yellow line I've drawn on Google Earth here, which is the exact angle of the side of the temple. Okay. And here we have the image of Google Earth, which gives us the angle of that line. We can't see it, so I made it bigger. So we see that the angle from north of this temple is 43.60 degrees. Now, that's a very interesting fact, because if we take our line that goes from this temple up to Esna, remember, that was 21.8 degrees. Now, if we take the other diagonal of this shape, and then we place, again, this same shape along that diagonal, that gives us another angle of 21.80 degrees, and we can see that it's the exact orientation of the temple. So the temple from north is orientated at an angle which is exactly twice the angle that links this temple to Esna. This is an angle of 43.6 degrees, 21.8 times 2. And this really confirms, these are facts, as I said, this is not interpretation of any kind. You can all check up on this. This confirms really the geometry that was intentional and that links this temple to the Temple of Esna over 100 kilometers away. This geometry could be expressed also in this way. If this time I place the diagonal of the 2x5 rectangle, if I place one diagonal on the north-south axis, then that will give the other diagonal exactly on the axis of the temple. This is another way of expressing the same geometry. The angle in the center of that geometry is 43.6 degrees. Okay? 2 times 21.8, as I've suggested. Now, this angle of 43.6 degrees is also the angle of a Pythagorean triangle. Okay, like the 3, 4, 5 triangle or the 5, 12, 13. These are the triangles with the right-angled triangles with whole numbers on all three sides. And there is one triangle, the 20, 21, 29 Pythagorean triangle, which has an angle of 43.6 degrees. This is very, very interesting knowledge of what's called the Pythagorean geometry and the modular geometry linked to the 2x5 square. Okay, so let's look now at the relationship of these three temples, Esna, Horus, Esna, Edfu, and Comombo. Okay, we can see there's a kind of triangle that links them together. And I'd like to look at this in more detail. To start off with, I'd like to talk about the geometrical relationship between the Temple of Khnum in Esna and the Temple of Horus in Edfu, which goes along the Nile more or less. Okay, we're more or less following the angle of the Nile here. So here we can see this, and we're going to now zoom into these temples. Again, same principle. This time I'm going to take a line on the right-hand side here of the temple. So instead of going to the center of the temple, I've put my point on the right-hand side, and I'm going to bring it down here to the left-hand side of the Temple of Edfu. That's going to give us an angle, we can read it here, of 137.66 degrees. And you'll see why I'm doing this in a second, why I'm going from one side of one temple to the other side of the other. So let's type in this angle, 137, here we go, 137.66 degrees. We're going to do the same principle, take the tangent of this angle, okay, gives us a value of 0.9112. And then if we multiply this by 45, that's going to give us a whole number, 41. So we can see here that the relationship between these two temples is a 41 to 45 relationship according to cardinal directions. Okay, now that may seem very complicated, but we're going to see it's very important. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to do is take the angle in the other direction. So here I'm going to go from the right-hand side of the temple of Edfu and go up to the bottom left corner here. Just at the bottom here, we can see, there we are, the bottom left corner of the temple at Esna. And we see 317.66 degrees. So this is the same angle, basically. It's 47.66 degrees north of west. And so, again, if I put in these figures and I do the same calculation, so let's type this in, 317.66. Okay, and we take the tangent of that. We're going to get the same result, 0.9112. So multiplied by 45 gives us 41. Okay, now this is important because it's showing the precision of this. Okay, because of the Earth's curvature, you get an angle which is different if you're going from north to south, south to north, unless you're on the meridian. The closer you get to a perfect north-south, the less deviation you have. But here we're almost at 45 degrees, so the deviation is quite important. As the line goes, it curves with the Earth's curve. And what we see here is that the size of these two temples, like I showed in the first video, okay, the size of these two temples take this into account. So if I go now from the temple of Edfu, of Esna, from the central part of the temple of Esna, the entrance to the central part, down to the entrance of the inner temple here at Edfu. So I'm going now exactly down the precise angle between the two extremes, between the two temples, from the entrance of the inner temple of each one, okay, we get an exact distance of 47,348 meters, okay? So between the entrance to the temple of Esna and the entrance to the inner temple of Edfu. So we're going to take this value, 47,348 meters, and I'm going to put that into memory for the time being, because to calculate the unit of measurement that's been used here, we have to first of all do the squares of 41 plus 45 and take the square root. So if we take 41 squared plus 45 squared, that's going to give us the value of 3,706. If we take the square root of that, we get 60.8769. Okay, so this value here is the number of units that we've got along the line between the two temples. So to find out how much that measures, what distance each unit measures, we have to take the whole distance and divide it by this number. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And if we do that, then we divide this by 1 over, we get 777.77 meters. Now, I hope you've seen the precision of these measurements. It's gone from the entrance to the inner temple of Esna to the entrance of the inner temple at Edfu, okay? And along a perfect geometrical axis, which has got rid of the differences between linked to the Earth's curve. Okay, so that is quite incredible information, because we're finding here a measurement which seems to be linked to the meter. I've already shown this in many previous occasions. How the Egyptians knew about the meter and used it. But here we get more proof of this, which is quite clear. Okay. So we can draw a grid here, which goes between the Temple of Esna and between the Temple of Edfu, or this grid is orientated on the cardinal directions, and it has 45 units north-south and 41 units east-west. Okay, so that's the exact angle of the relationship between these two temples. And each little red square measures 777.77 meters. That means that 9 squares measure 7,000 meters. In the video I've done, which I've called Karnak and the Pyramid Plan, we see how 7,000 meters is a distance which was used between the pyramids. Okay? So this is another example of the use of 7,000 meters as a measurement system. And 45 squares, which is the north-south axis, that's 5 times 9, so 5 times 7, that's 35,000 meters north-south between these two temples. Okay, so that's an interesting point. Now we're going to put that to one side now, and now we're going to look at the relationship between Edfu and Komombo. Okay, so again, we're going more or less down the axis of the Nile. The Nile is moving here. Okay, well, it's moving up on the north-south axis, and we're going now from this temple down to this temple. And so you can see how this geometry is linked to the course of the Nile. Okay, so they're positioning the geometry according to the course of the Nile. Now, again, we're going to look into the geometry involved here. So we're going to zoom in again to Komombo. Now, this time we're going to look at the part here on the left, the older part of the temple. I'm going to zoom in here, look to this left part. Okay, we're going to have a look at this, because here we can see these are the remains of the older part. You remember that Komombo had an old part to it, which was built in the Middle Empire, and then the more recent temple built in the New Kingdom. Okay. So I'm going to put a point on this spot here, which is part of the old temple. And we're going to go up right again here to the Temple of Horus in Edfu. And here we get an angle of 354.67 degrees with a distance of 58,586 meters. Okay, so this is more or less north-south. We're very close to north-south, so we don't have to go back and forth here. We can look at this one angle. So here, if we take 354.67, we take the tangent of that, we get a number. Now, if I multiply this number by 75, it gives me a result of 6.9977. So the angle involved here is 75 north-south, 7 east-west. Okay, that's the geometry that we can find over this whole line here. Okay, so that's an important thing to take in. let's have a look at this, what happens here. So if we have 7 squared, we're going to do the same process to find the diagonal. 7 squared plus 75 squared gives us 5,670, whatever it was. Now if we take the square root of that, 75,32595. Okay. Now that's the number of units along the line. So we're going to take the distance, which we see above, 58,586 meters. And we're now going to divide that. I put that into the memory. So we're going to divide that by the number of units down that diagonal. And this gives us 777.77 meters. So we discover that we have exactly the same unit that was used here between these two temples, between Komombo and Edfu, as the unit used between Edfu and Esna. Okay, sorry. So let's just look at that. That's the triangle, the 7 by 75 triangle. 75 units north-south, so it's very slightly off the north-south axis. Okay, 75 by 7. Again, each unit measures 777.77 meters. So let's look at the whole thing. So we have the first triangle, 45 by 41, then the second, 75 by 7. These are the same units, so we can add them together. So on the north-south line, we have 45 plus 75, 120. And on the east-west, 41 plus 7, 48. This gives us a ratio of 48 to 120, which is our 2:5 ratio, which we discovered to begin with. So we can see how the geometrical 2:5 relationship, which we saw between Esna and Komombo, has been divided according to the course of the Nile in 2 different geometrical systems. And this is a very, very important thing. Like I say, this is fact. So I've put the grid here. You can see the yellow grid, which its corner is in the Temple of Khnum. Then we go down here to the Temple of Horus in Edfu. You can see how the temple is exactly on the junction of the grid lines here. And then we go down to Komombo, and we can see that the corner of the grid is exactly on the temple in Komombo. So this is an incredible, massive grid that has been placed, that I've placed on the on Google Earth, and which quite clearly shows the exactitude of this geometrical implantation of these 3 temples. So again, each little square, we have 120 north-south, 48 east-west. Each little square side measures 777.77 meters. And to finish, I'd just like to point out a very astounding fact, is that these are squares with sides of 777.77 meters. If you take the diagonal of the square, then you have to multiply that by the square root of 2. If you do that, you obtain 1,099.94 meters, which is only, 6 centimeters away from 1,100 meters. So what we discover is that we are using, that the Egyptians who put this into place had managed to use the meter on the sides of the square, but also on the diagonals of the square. And that's quite an incredible fact. That means that these numbers were specifically chosen to link into the square root of 2. So that's the end of the second part of this talk. It shows how between all these temples in southern Egypt, there was precise modular geometry compensating the Earth's curvature and using the meter and the kilometre long before our history was written down. If you want to learn more about my work, I've got a series of books which you can find at howardcrowhurst.com, and also the different sites that you can visit to learn more about my work. I know it's sometimes quite complicated, it needs to be studied, but it is not just suggestions or hypotheses. It's very important to realize that this is actual fact. Bye-bye.